Good morning. Access Rhode Island is sponsoring this, but John Merriam from Common Cause has done a lot of the work on it, and I want to thank him. Access Rhode Island is a coalition that was founded in the late 1990s by a group of organizations in Rhode Island, led by the Rhode Island Press Association. The organizations that belong to this coalition are the Rhode Island Press Association, Common Cause, the ACLU, the Rhode Island chapter affiliate, League of Women Voters in Rhode Island, the New England First Amendment Coalition, and I want to make sure I'm not missing anybody. No, we have various members from these organizations on our board. We've tried to make this an annual event, although it doesn't always happen every year. It's important, I think, that the public be aware that it's not just journalists out there looking for information where they have to go to public offices and ask them for records and other information that would be available by law for them to write and produce their stories. And this program today is kind of a reminder of how important the access to public records law is. And I'm going to turn this over to one of our terrific supporters of access and journalism in the state, who happens to work out of state. This is Ed Fitzpatrick. And he covers Rhode Island, though, he does a darn good job. Ed Fitzpatrick from the Boston Globe.
All right, thank you. For the record, I work in the state, in Providence, right here for the Boston Globe, covering Rhode Island. My name's Ed Fitzpatrick, and thanks for coming out this morning. There's a lot of sunshine out there, so I'm glad you came in out of it to talk about Sunshine Week. If you didn't see it on the way in, we have eclipse viewers, because there's going to be a solar eclipse on April 8th on the table over there, along with some coffee. This is Sunshine Week. It's brought to you by Access Rhode Island, the state's Freedom of Information Coalition. It's part of Common Cause Rhode Island's Demystifying Democracy educational series. Sunshine Week, as you know, is a nonpartisan collaboration among groups in the journalism, civic, education, government, and private sectors that shines a light on the importance of public records and open government. The purpose of the week is to highlight the fact that government functions best when it operates in the open. So we've got an all-star cast here for the panel, so I'm going to introduce them. Closest to me is Eli Sherman. He's an Emmy and Murrow award-winning journalist who joined the 12 News Investigative Unit in 2019, having previously worked as an investigative reporter for Gatehouse Media. He's also covered economics for Providence Business News and worked as a Metro reporter for the Waltham News Tribune. Next to him is Colleen Cronin. She covers environmental issues for EcoRI News, a nonprofit newsroom that reports on environmental and social justice issues. She previously worked as a digital producer and Metro correspondent for the Globe, staying up all night, writing education stories and breaking news overnight. Wheeler Copperwaite has been the Providence Journal's growth and development reporter since 2022. He previously worked at the Patriot Ledger in Quincy, Mass. And the Cape Cod Times, and he worked for 5 years as at an investigative weekly newspaper in New Mexico. So thanks for joining us today, and we're all storytellers up here, so let's begin by each telling a story about public records. Eli, one of the most bonkers stories of last year involved two high-level Rhode Island officials who were accused of making sexist and racist comments and demanding everything from a cold six-pack to vegan cheese during a trip to Philadelphia to visit a company that was seeking to redevelop the Cranston Street Armory. So tell us a bit about that.
Sure. Hello, and thank you for having me. This was a pretty crazy story, and we're going to talk a lot about the access to public records law today. But to get right into it, I had received a tip, and you can jump forward a couple slides here. Yeah, so I'm gonna go through basically my fight to get this public record. What happened is that I had heard through a source that these two high-ranking state directors had made this business trip on the public's time to Philadelphia, and they were going there to sort of check out a facility that they might try to replicate for the Cranston Street Armory, which is, of course, across the border in Providence. And they behaved badly. That's what the tip was. So apparently this was memorialized in a letter. The people that they went to visit were so disgusted with the way that they had behaved that they put it into a letter and they sent it to the governor. So I asked for that letter, and I was told no. And this is pretty typical with the Access to Public Records law. It is a very powerful law, and John Marion of Common Cause is going to talk to you a little bit about it and what he's trying to change about it, but my boss, Tim White, likes to call it the menu to say no. There are more than 26 exemptions in it. It has existed for a long time and has been tweaked and tweaked and tweaked, and they've added all these different ways that they can say no when you ask for a public record. So in this case, they said basically that they couldn't give me the letter because it would be an invasion of privacy to the two gentlemen. And that also, I think because it identified them by name, and they also, it was an investigatory record. So these are two exemptions. These are two reasons why they say they can't give me the record. In reality, they just didn't want to give it to me. So I appealed that, which is a process in which anyone can go through. You don't need to be a lawyer. You don't need to be a journalist. Anyone can do this. It's written into the law. You can appeal when people say no to the Attorney General, which is what I did here. And you can go and you can read decisions that have been made in the past. And I can't stress enough that you don't need to be a lawyer. I am not a lawyer by any means. But you can go back and you can read how they decided on different things and build your argument that way.
So you wrote this?
I wrote this.
You wrote what
Yep.
the attorney?
Right. And so I submitted that to the Attorney General, and then the state then gets a chance to respond. Their chief legal counsel came back with their argument. They cited all this case law and why it was that it needed to be exempted and shielded from the public. In the meantime, me and Kathy Gregg at the Providence Journal, also added at the Globe, and Steve, I see out there, stories were coming out about it, and interest just kept building and building and building. What the heck is in this letter? And so as part of that argument that I made to the Attorney General was called a balancing test, and was the public's interest in this document greater than the privacy of the two gentlemen of which the letter was about?
And just tell us a bit about the balancing test. How did they come about and what are they balancing?
Yeah, so about a decade ago, I think was the last time that the law was changed, right, John, is that right? The last revamp that there was of the law, they implemented this balancing test, and it was supposed to give a little bit more power to the public in terms of knowing what was going on behind the scenes if you could show that it was in the public's interest. And it's something that's at the discretion of the Attorney General, Peter Nerona, and I will say, having done this across different Attorney Generals, they sort of, depending on who they are, will decide one way or another. So in this case, we made the argument for the balancing test, and the Attorney General ended up ruling, can you go to the next one? Yeah, ruling in our favor, finding that the governor had in fact violated the Access to Public Records law, and demanded that he release the letter, which then they subsequently did follow. They do have the option in fights for public records, if the Attorney General does rule against a public body, they can appeal that to the Superior Court, which they decide not to do and just release the letter, which was pretty salacious. And it was, some of you may remember the reporting around that. It was about a year ago. And it really detailed some egregious behavior about the two directors. You go to the next slide. and it came out, created quite a stir. And you can go to the next one. So we had been reporting on what, we were told. We couldn't get into specifics because we never had the letter, but we knew that there was some allegations of inappropriate behavior by these two powerful people in state government who were working on the public's dime. And the fallout from that was pretty significant. You can go to the next one. But there was a state police investigation that the governor started as we were going through this fight to try and see if maybe there were any laws that were broken.
And just bring us up to date on that. Has that been completed?
There has not been a conclusion to that, Ed, so we're not really sure where it stands, as it often happens with police investigations. There was a ethics probe into both of the men, the state directors. That is still ongoing. They meet every Tuesday, first month.
Yeah, it's been on the agenda, right? So it should be concluded.
So we should be hearing what that is, and they'll determine whether or not the state ethics code has been broken. One of the directors resigned, the other one was kind of pushed out, and there was a big change, and then the state ended up canceling that contract with the people that they went to visit. So there was quite a lot of fallout that came from just this one public record. Of course, because of the behavior of the two gentlemen in Philadelphia, but the state went through great lengths, spent a lot of taxpayer money trying to keep this record secret, and it just showed sort of how powerful it can be when you are able to access these documents that government tries to hide sometimes, and what an effect they can have on the direction of the public's work. So that is, by and large, one of the bigger fights that I've had recently, but we do this all the time. I currently have 5 or 6 or 7 of these requests in and these fights going on, and it's sort of ongoing. There is an immense pushback from public bodies to try and keep public records secret, and we do what we can to try and shed light on that.
Just to get into the Attorney General's findings, did he find that it was a knowing and willful violation? Was there any penalty for what the governor's office did?
He did not. It is pretty rare that the Attorney General's office will rule that way, in my experience. It's kind of a high bar to prove intent of knowingly and willingly, which does come with fines. But it's kind of a silly system in my mind, because even when the fines are assessed, they're assessed to a public body and then it comes back to the state. So sort of taking money out of one pocket, putting it in the other. But it does not look good, of course, when a public body is trying to keep something secret and then, turns out that they're not supposed to.
All right. Colleen, could you tell us what happened when you submitted a public records request to the Department of Transportation for crash data? When did you request it, and what was DOT's response?
Okay, this thing is on. Hi everybody, it's nice to see you all. I feel very honored to be a part of this group today. So my request actually started off with the Department of Transportation before it was really an active request. I was reading, I think, like Axios's Boston local newsletter, and they were talking about how pedestrian fatalities were up in Massachusetts. And I was like, oh, that's so interesting. Massachusetts and Rhode Island tend to track a lot of the time, or we like to think we're tracking in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. So I thought to myself, I'll try to figure out if I can get that data, because I'm an environmental reporter, but I also cover transportation, big part of environmental policy, and so I was interested. So I reached out to the Department of Transportation, and I said, just to their spokesperson, I said, hey, do you have this data? I'd like to get it. And the spokesperson got back, oh yeah, I'll look into it, I'll let you know. And then I probably emailed back, this is not, a super pressing story for me, it was more like an enterprise thing I wanted to work on. I get back a couple days later, hey, any word on that? Oh yeah, I'm looking into it. I probably reached out one more time, and I was like, hey, I just want to know if I need to make a formal request with this, and I never heard back. So then I decided to file an ACRA. So I was just looking at pedestrian fatalities, and I was looking for a couple of years of data, because I was trying to look for, pre and post COVID, and I got a answer back from the Department of Transportation saying we can only honor that request, sort of. We'll give you information on the age, the gender, and the date of when those crashes happened, but we can't give you the location.
And that's what you were looking for.
And that was what I was looking for. That's what I really wanted. Because I was trying to see where might be the most dangerous places for pedestrians to walk around, and maybe how could those areas be improved. And they told me that the reason they couldn't give the data to me was because they were really concerned that if people had that data, it could be used against them in a lawsuit. And they cited some federal law saying that some court decision that, you know, they don't have to do that if they're possibly going to get sued. So I thought that was kind of wild. I'm from Massachusetts, and I've worked in Massachusetts as a reporter, and that information is public. There's actually a whole database and like a platform that's easily searchable to find all sorts of information about crash data. And I know there's a couple other states that have similar stuff. So I thought that was really strange, and I talked to my editor, and she was like, oh, why don't you reach out to some advocates and see if, you know, they might have the data. So I reached out to Providence Streets Coalition, which is a great group. If you don't know about them, look into them. They do a lot of advocacy for transportation and bike and pedestrian safety. And they told me that they had been having the same problem as me, that they'd been requesting this data for a while statewide, and they were having a lot of trouble getting it, but that Providence had given them the data for the city, and so that was what they were working with. And I was like, oh, this is so weird. I'm not the only person asking for this, and they're not giving it. I could just go to every police department in the state and ask for the data. I didn't want to do that because, you know, we only have so much time. We only have, you know, 5 people working at E4I, so we've got a lot of things going on all at once. And I decided, well, if other people have requested this data, but I know I'm not the only person, I'll APRA the APRAs, which is like, you know, I'll request information on all the other requests for this
That's where you
information.
by the way.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Very good.
I had sort of heard of a couple of people in my like travels who had done similar things when they'd been really like roadblocked by agencies, and they thought they should get the data, and they thought that, you know, using maybe a balancing test, if this is in the public's interest to get it, like maybe if I can show that a lot of people are asking for it, I can get it. So I had gotten very little information on that first APRA request about what I really wanted, but then when I looked into how many requests had happened over like the course of 3 years, I got a ton of documents back, and it showed that a lot of people were asking for this info. So that was the main thing that I was looking for, like to say like, hey, you know, 12 people have asked for this in the last 3 years, most of them academics, who just want to use it to try to make the world safer, better place, you know, not in a nefarious way, no one really asking for it even for a legal case.
Yeah, there were no requests from lawyers seeking.
No,
to
there were
go to court.
none of that. It was everybody was an academic or a nonprofit trying to get this information.
And can I ask, did they charge you for that information?
It was like a $300 fee to get that information. I got hundreds of documents because, you know, I asked not only, and you have to be careful when you're making a request because you have to be specific or not so specific, but both things can hurt you. But I wanted both the formal requests through APRA and then also any informal requests. So that kind of ended up giving me some internal documents. And that led to something sort of interesting. I had proven this thing that you know, a lot of people were asking for this information, getting denied. And then I saw that they actually had given it to someone. And not only had they denied the request from all of these sort of nonprofits and institutions asking for the data, they actually just ended up giving the data to a private company that had worked with them before, but for a project that had nothing to do with RIDOT. It was just a private development that this engineering firm ended up, like, you know, they had this very common practice of the internal consultants saying, hey, I need crash data for a traffic study on this project you're working on. And so that was a very common for them to fulfill those requests because it was all internal. But then, you know, that they had that sort of relationship developed already, and in the same email thread, someone's like, oh, and I'm actually working on this private project, can you give me that data too? And they gave it to them. So that was surprising.
Deciding who they want to give it to, who they like, they're going to give it to.
Exactly. So then I was like, well, that's a story. So I wrote that story, even though I really wanted to just write a story about where the fatal accidents were. I ended up, I think, maybe writing a story that made them look worse at the end. And of course, I also reached out to Rhode Island to try to get comment on that. They didn't really respond to anything that I had to say. I did file a complaint also with the Attorney General, which it's terrifying. I think you might have seen it in this. It was things was Sherman versus Office of Governor. I got this email that said Cronin versus Rydot.
Yeah.
So I have filed a complaint with the Attorney General to try to get the data still, because the APRA bill, an APRA bill that's in the General Assembly right now, would make traffic accident data a public record officially. But you know, this was last year that I was working on this, and I haven't heard back from the Attorney General. I don't know when or if I will. I filed that complaint. I filed my rebuttal to my complaint in September after I published, or October after I published my article. I basically used my article as my rebuttal, saying if they gave it, and APRA requesters should be treated equally under the law. That's what's supposed to happen. And if they gave it to this private company, they should be giving it to all these citizens and reporters who are asking for it too.
And what do other states do? You mentioned Massachusetts. Did you look at how many states do provide this data?
I didn't do that. Amy Russo at the Providence Journal did a wonderful story. Actually, we were kind of reporting on this at the same time, and I had been sort of thinking about writing a story like her, just talking about all the other states that were making this data available. So Connecticut's another one that it's not, I think, as great a portal as Massachusetts, but they also make the data available. And part of the reason why I decided to APRA that was because her story was so good, and I didn't want to write the same story, so I just decided, all right, I got to look into this instead. So you should read her story if you haven't in the Providence Journal. She's been following this as well, just about how kind of ridiculous it is and how other states like Connecticut and Massachusetts, who are always trying to emulate Rhode Island, are already doing this thing.
Right, and to underscore your point, you're saying that other states are not only not rejecting these requests for data, they're proactively putting it up online so the public can have access to it to show what intersections are dangerous, where crashes are happening, right?
It's like a really useful portal. It's called Impact, and being in Massachusetts, I played around with it a little bit and for my town, and it'll show you can do all sorts of queries, like did an accident involve a tractor trailer? Did it involve a bike? Looking at, I know there's one intersection that I am always terrified of walking by in my hometown, so I looked at that to see how many crashes have happened in the last couple of years. And I never got to talk to anybody from the Rhode Island Department of Transportation, but I did talk to the folks at the Massachusetts Department of Transportation for an interview, the woman who runs the impact program there, and she said that the reason why they did it was because they were getting so many requests anyway. They just felt like it was silly for them to not, they'd honor them anyway. Why are we going to waste our time having to go through all these things? Let's just make the data available so it's not a time sink for us anymore.
Right. So have you or others been able to report on where the accidents are happening? And because you mentioned you can get the data from individual police departments, right?
There's been a lot of reporting recently on Providence. North Main Street is a hotspot. The Providence Streets Coalition, after they had made sort of their own requests and were able to get the data directly from the Providence Police Department, they made a heat map that shows where all those pedestrian and bike fatalities are happening. And they were actually able to get, I think a special crosswalk on a section of North Main Street recently. And so they're, at the point being, if you can prove where these things are happening, you can better advocate for the type of measures that might actually make a difference. So that's, Providence is I think usually a pretty good example of, and maybe you guys would disagree with me, Providence Police Department is pretty good about giving data. I, in college, had done some projects where they'd given us data. Maybe it depends on the person who's asking, I don't know. But, sometimes it just would be difficult, I think, to get it for one reporter. Maybe a team of reporters would be easier to ask all those cities and towns. But at least we have some information on Providence.
Great. Well, two great examples here with Eli and Colleen of using public records requests to tell some of the most important stories in the past year in Rhode Island. Wheeler, you've worked in other states. I think the comparisons to other states tells us a lot. And you've worked in New Mexico, right?
Yeah, and I was an investigative reporter. I was a cops reports reporter at Rio Grande Sun, which is the investigative weekly newspaper in Espanola, which I think in 2009, maybe it was earlier than that, Forbes called the heroin capital of the world. And the LA Times actually just recently did a story on like how bad it is. To like give an example of like, as a cops reports reporter, I was covering a lot of police misconduct and overdoses, and I actually had an entire series that we did every year that had been started before me, where I had to go to the Office of Medical Investigator and get every single autopsy report for our county for the prior year, and then go through them and figure out how many of these were overdoses. Sometimes you catch homicides that you didn't know about, or things that were classified as homicides after the initial like death investigation. Like I had one where they did like an x-ray and found that there was a bullet in somebody's chest that they thought was a heart attack. And so through this data, we were able to show multiple times that, you know, the state or the CDC will tell you, oh, we have, you know, let's say 100 overdoses in the county, or like whatever the number is. But you look at the data and you're like, okay, well, you're not, you know, what are you basing this on? Like when I look at the autopsy report, it's clear to me that your number is not accurate. And it's not clear to me like what you're including and what you're not. And like, let's say they say there's, you know, 20 fentanyl deaths. And it's like, okay, well I can go look at the autopsy reports and figure out that, you know, you're not including people who, you're only including acute fentanyl overdoses, right? So people who had a lethal level of fentanyl. But if you've ever reported on overdose deaths, you know that like most of the time people are doing speedballs. They're like on cocaine and fentanyl, or they're on cocaine, Valium, and fentanyl, or they're on, you know, an opiate and a benzodiazepine and a some kind of stimulant, and that these are oftentimes, or alcohol, and these are what causes deaths, is the interactions between these multiple drugs. So in New Mexico, you know, God bless them, the autopsy reports are like fully public records, and Rhode Island they're fully not public records. So that's like a perfect example, I think, of the incredible things that you can do with better public records law, or certain types of records that, like here, are just totally off limits.
And I found it amazing that you had said that search fees are not permitted in New Mexico. Tell us about that. Because we're paying Colleen paid $300. We're paying a lot of money for these records.
Yeah, so in New Mexico and a few other states, you can't charge for anything other than the actual cost of the physical copies if you're asking for a physical copy, or the charge to like put it on a physical medium. So like when you're asking for emails, then they can technically charge you for the USB stick that it costs to put the things on. But if you provide the DVD, if you provide the CD, if you provide the USB stick, they can't charge you for it. So my experience in New Mexico was that I could get almost anything, and it was quite incredible. And then I moved to the Northeast, Cape Cod Times, Patriot Ledger, and it's like, okay, well I just can't use the records law anymore. Because it's just so, because everybody uses either search fees or redaction fees, depending on the state, as a cudgel. And to me, it's incredible in Rhode Island that, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but the, you know, search fees that the state will use to prevent people from getting information. You're not even charging for redaction, you're just charging these insane, you know, $15 an hour times X amount of hours for emails or whatever else. And, you know, it's unfortunate, but it's used as a weapon to make it so that we can't get records, because we just don't have enough. I mean, sorry, like $300, that's an insane amount of money. Patrick, I was in the office with him the other day, and he was just like screaming about the bridge emails because they charged him so much money. And, you know, that came out of his pocket. Yeah, like, I mean, he's like, I don't want to make a reimbursement. It came out of my bank account.
Yeah.
You know, like, eventually, you know, we'll pay him back, but eventually, it's not today.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that feeling you bring a personal check to the state.
Yeah, literally.
It sticks with you. But tell us, in New Mexico, tell us about the burden on the public officials fulfilling these requests, because that's what we hear, that if we have to do this, it's a huge burden, because we're going to have to go through, and it's going to be 70 hours of search and retrieval time, and then we have to redact everything, and there's other things that the taxpayers are paying us to do.
Well, so I think that what's so interesting is so often they will default to attorneys handling it, which I think anyone will tell you is like a worst practice, is like a full worst practice. You should never, your records custodian should never be an attorney, full stop. So they'll
That's a great point, because like in the past, it's been clerks, but is it more often these days that you're dealing with an attorney?
yeah, I think that we've both like experienced this like very recently with the bridge or with other things where everybody's just like defaulting to the attorney. A lot of towns that don't get a lot of requests are defaulting to their town solicitor handling it, and it's like, why are you, your attorney shouldn't be processing this. If this is a, if this is something where it's clearly a question, then sure, send it to your attorney. But for like routine public records requests, there's absolutely no reason that someone who's charging $300 or $150 to $300 an hour should be handling these requests. And then so towns are crying that like, oh my God, it takes so long. It's such a burden on us to get these records. And it's like, well, you're having your attorney deal with this. You just hire a clerk. So I think my biggest point is that while everyone says, oh, if you make it free, the sky is going to fall, I can tell you in New Mexico, the sky didn't fall. The land of enchantment, the sky is still there. It is much sunnier than it is in Rhode Island.
It's still enchanted.
It's still enchanted. They have much fewer resources than Rhode Island is. I was in a county that is literally the size of Connecticut. The physical size of Rio Grande County is the size of Connecticut. And they have, I think, 40,000 people. If I had to go to court, I had to drive an hour and 15 minutes to get to court from the main city in the town. It is not, the sky doesn't fall, it is not that big of a burden. I think that the problem is that, when you're asking for emails, it's just like search fees are just going to block you from getting it with search fees. But the problem is when you're asking for any type of record, if they don't want to give it to you, they're just going to levy a gigantic, enormous fee that they know that you can't pay, and then that's how they deal with it. And that's deeply, deeply problematic. And I think one of the reasons why the search fee needs to be gotten rid of, because it's profound to me that the search fee is being so abused. If it was like a search and redaction fee where we're getting $1,000 for like a simple request, not saying I can see that, but it seems like a little less egregious than when they're charging $1,000 for $15 an hour for a search fee. It does not take that long to search for public records, or you have a deep problem in your system.
That's a good way to put it. It's used as a cudgel. Can you tell us about a new nationwide review by the Associated Press and by CNHI News that it talked about what happens around the nation in terms of resolving open government disputes that often put the burden of enforcing these laws on private citizens?
Absolutely. So I think their review found that less than a third of public bodies have a resource for people who are going to make complaints to be able to get it adjudicated without having to go to file a lawsuit themselves. And I think that one of the problems with these reviews is that when you try to look up who has the best public records law, Florida always comes up, right? But Florida has 1,000 exemptions, and Florida is a great state. My former state of New Mexico is not actually rated very highly, which I think that illustrates kind of some of the problems with the national discourse about how you deal with records laws and how these things are. So our Attorney General is the one who could technically adjudicate a request. Say in Massachusetts, the Attorney General can actually could go to court over something, and once in a while they do. But I think that the devil is oftentimes in the details, and one of those big details is a question of who represents state or local agencies in these records disputes if somebody does go to court. So if the default is that the Attorney General will represent the state entity in a lawsuit, you now have this conflict of interest because they're also the ones who are supposed to be taking them to court if they're not giving up the records. And when I was in New Mexico, if somebody was defending themselves in a records lawsuit, they always had to hire they either used their internal attorneys or they had to hire attorneys. They never used the Attorney General. The Attorney General never represented anyone in public records lawsuits. In Massachusetts, that's a huge, huge problem. The Attorney General consistently defending people in public records lawsuits.
And
So,
are there other models? Because like when I was a reporter in New York, if you had an open records dispute, I recall this guy named Robert Freeman, who was the executive director of something called the Freedom of Information Committee. He was an attorney, and you could quote him in the story saying, "This is outrageous that they're not giving me these documents," but he could also sue. But are there other ways to do it?
yeah, so I think that a few few states have ombudsmen or other sort of like entities that try to ameliorate the situation or adjudicate situations, but they're few and far between. And I think that most of the time they sort of side with the public bodies. I think there are a couple of, is it the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press has hired attorneys, I believe, in a couple of states, or is doing a couple of pilot programs to provide attorneys to sue agencies over these issues. Rhode Island is not one of those states. So, you know, somebody pumping in a bunch of money to file a bunch of record lawsuits is definitely one of the ways that can happen. But I think speaking of the devil being in the details, I think part of the problem is, you know, we talk a lot about search fees, redaction, all those things, but at the end of the day, if you're going to file a lawsuit, you need to be able to recover attorney's fees, and that's like one of the bigger problems that I think that we don't usually address is in New Mexico, I had to get deposed because we sued the state records, the state police for records that they withheld related to a crazy criminal case that came out of Nevada, and then also other records. And at the end of the day, they settled for like $250,000 or something like that. And part of that was attorney's fees, and part of that was like fines and what, or them admitting to like fines. And so the newspaper got a little bit of a payday. In New Mexico, there are a lot of attorneys that are very good at suing public agencies for public records, and they usually get decent settlements for their clients. And I think that that's an incredible enforcement action. I think the problem is, you know, when there isn't any money, if you win the case, then there's no reason for an attorney to take it, and there's no reason for someone to bring it unless they have very, very deep pockets. And I think both of our newspapers no longer have the deep pockets that they once had to be able to file those enforcement actions.
So just to let you know, the audience will have a chance to ask the panel some questions, so hold on to those for a little while longer. Let me ask you guys, Rhode Island's public records law has not been updated, as Eli mentioned, in more than a decade. And by comparison to some other states, as we're pointing out, has some weaknesses. So could you each provide an example of a public records frustration or something you would change, if you could, about ACRA? Eli.
Sure. So I think something that is in this proposed amendment to the law that Common Cause is working on along with others, excuse me, is that, and there are a million things, right? I mean, we could spend all day talking about
47 things in the bill.
Yeah, again, there are so many exemptions that say do away with all of them because, again, APRA is the floor. This is something the Attorney General points out all the time. It's the floor, not the ceiling. So nobody's going to jail if they give you a public record. It's just not going to happen. And what the law allows them to do is say no. And they've been adding on and on and on to that for years, different ways to be able to say no. And it's terrible. But one thing that this proposed amendment to the law would change this year, if it's able to pass the General Assembly, is that it would make incident reports a public record. So when something happens and police respond and it doesn't result in an arrest, they put together what's called an incident report. So nobody was arrested, there's no arrest report, but they came to so-and-so's house for disturbance, they interacted with some people, all those details are written down in a report, put in a file. As it stands now, that is not a public record. That they can withhold that, they don't have to give that to you unless there's an arrest. This proposed change would make that a public record, and the importance of that is that for us as reporters and for the public, the law is not the bar for telling a story. And so we don't need there to be an arrest for there to be a story. In fact, sometimes that there isn't an arrest could be the story. right? So say the police go to some powerful lawmaker's home and they've done something bad, and they don't arrest the person maybe because they're powerful. All that is written into an incident report, tucked in a file. We can't see it if they don't want to give it to us. What this change would do would make that public, and it's a really important thing because incident reports oftentimes are filled with all sorts of information that the public might want to know. And as it stands now, it is one of the most frustrating things to be able to see this exists. There's information in here that I think the public might want to know, and they, by all legal rights, can say no.
And it's to underscore the point, it's public officials using the police power.
Absolutely. I mean, this is what we've discussed here is that we're already paying them all for their time. And this idea also with fees, which I think we're going to talk about, and you talked about very eloquently, is that we've already paid you for this. And now you have the gall to ask us to pay you again. And it boggles the mind to think that somehow we need to pay double for something that you just don't want to give us.
And I agree, incident reports could be a gold mine. My first job out of Syracuse was at the Glens Falls Post-Star, and I covered City Hall, and Mayor Keefe drove drunk one day on a Friday night, swerving down the main street, and the Glens Falls police pulled him over, and there was no arrest. There was no arrest report. They drove him home. It was like an Uber. And brought him home and said, "Thank you, Mayor, we'll bring the car back to City Hall." And so, I heard about that and got the records that showed that what happened. So it helped to tell the story. So, Colleen, what is frustration or something you would change?
So many things, as Eli said. I wish it was free, wish they would get back to you faster than they do. I will not go on more about that, but I think something that the law is going to hopefully address if it's passed would be those traffic accidents. I still want to write that story. I still want to write about where those dangerous intersections are. I think it's great that we know about what's going on in Providence, but I'm a Report for America Corps member so they sort of fund and kind of add parameters onto my position at EcoRI, and I'm really supposed to cover outside of Providence because they have a focus on rural areas, which you might all laugh at what is considered rural. There's actually some federal grants that consider Central Falls rural because it's so small population-wise, despite the fact that it's so dense. I think that's kind of funny. But I want to know, and I think, again, it's great that we know about Providence, but what about Westerly? What about, Foster? What about all these, places where, maybe there are actually less sidewalks and people are getting hit, or places where people can't afford to have a car and they're only getting around on a bike. But, so I think that could be great. I think there could be a lot of great stories, and we could be holding the government more accountable than we are.
Yeah, I want to know about Smithfield, my hometown. Wheeler.
Search fees have to go. I think that's the number one thing for me is search fees absolutely have to be eliminated. I think what also bothers me is the use of the federal language in Rhode Island's law for drafts. New Mexico, drafts are not privileged, they're not secret, they're you can just get the drafts of things. Sometimes police reports, actually incident reports as well, and also 911 dispatch logs, so incredibly important because so many things happen that don't result in an arrest because police respond to so many things that are not arrestable offenses. So I think the search fees have to go, the elimination of all language about not being able to get drafts because things can be in drafts for years or only stay in draft, you can never get it. I think autopsy reports need to become public records. And speaking of that, I think the biggest issue is this magical, this is an entire issue in the Northeast, but this idea that privacy should be upheld or that everyone should have privacy. Seems like a very, in America, I think that we don't normally think that we have a major right to privacy when it comes to our interactions with public officials or whatever. And it's, in New Mexico, there's no privacy exemption. And I think that the privacy exemption we see time and time again is just used to shield bad conduct. It is used to shield idiotic conduct. It's used to shield random stupid things that shouldn't be shielded. And I think that the privacy exemption just has to be totally cut out. And I realize that I'm probably, people can scream to the high heavens that that's like something we absolutely need to keep. But telling you, lived in a state where there is no privacy exemption, and again, the sky did not fall.
It does sound like New Mexico is the land of public records enchantment. I recently, to drill down a bit more on the fees, I recently asked Governor McKee's office and the DOT for records showing how much they've charged reporters over the past year for records shedding light on important matters like the Washington Bridge, Tidewater land and stuff like that. And it turned, thousands of dollars charged to WPRI, to the Journal, to others. So Eli, tell us how much fees became an issue when DOT charged reporters varying amounts for documents regarding the closure of the Washington Bridge. Westlaw.
Yeah, this was a weird one. So obviously, you all know the Washington Bridge is closed, and it's been a bit confusing. They shut it down really abruptly without sort of any notice, and for any of you that have to travel over it any amount, it's quite a headache. And so, as with any sort of big, abrupt, unexpected thing that happens in government, reporters typically try to figure out what went wrong. So a lot of us, I think most news outlets, filed access for public records requests for emails surrounding the day that it closed. Basically trying to get a glimpse into what it was that public officials were communicating about, what led up to the closure, who knew what when, sort of just basic accountability things. Oftentimes they lay in emails because that's how a lot of government communicates. I believe at WPRI we were charged $300 and something for that request. And reporters all talk. So we discovered, as did others, that I think that the Journal was charged $450, and the Globe, the all-powerful Globe, was charged.
We got charged nothing.
$9.
One request because it got narrowed, but they said, well, we're giving it to, we already had it for the other
Right.
outlets. We'll give you, but they were charging us $1,000 for another request.
Yeah.
For the Washington Bridge document, so none of it made sense.
So we were all after the same thing, and for some reason the same agency was charging us 3 different prices. And they didn't really have a great explanation. And as he explained, the Globe sort of tailored their request to what we were requesting, so maybe DOT was like, oh, WPRI is paying it anyways. We'll give it to them for free. Regardless, it just shows sort of the nebulous world of how they assess how much they're going to charge you. And what's funny about that is that the governor actually ended up directing DOT to give us our money back after all of us sort of reported on
But
it.
that money back guarantee does not apply to any other situation, right?
Nothing. Again, it was,
It's going to continue charging.
and the 4 of us could probably talk about access to public records law for days and be entertained. And it's always interesting to me
Won't
to
be days,
see.
just another hour.
Promise. But it's always interesting to me to see what sort of resonates with people when we talk about it publicly. And the fee thing really sort of struck a chord with a lot of readers and viewers, and they were like, what the heck is going on here? It became sort of a political headache for the governor, and then he directed DOT to pay us our money back, which then we promptly took and paid towards another public records fight that we owed money on. So
don't you think it showed people the value of these public records?
absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of money in government that's paid to people to tell their story, right? They pay a lot of people to tell you a narrative of what they're doing, and it is always positive. It's always rah rah, we're doing a good thing, and sometimes that is the case. I don't want to stand here and say that government is bad. It's just not the case. But oftentimes there is bad behavior on behalf of money that we spend. And we need to be able to have a clear window into what it is that public officials are doing, because we can't always buy exactly what their narrative of what happened is in fact what happened. And to Wheeler's point, they often will assess these fees to get you to go away. And it can be incredibly frustrating and difficult to pin down. And what's best about it is that when they do charge you a fee, they say, okay, Eli, it's gonna cost us $300. We think it's gonna cost us $300 to do this work. We need you to pay us now. And oh, by the way, when we get done, if it ended up taking us more time, we're gonna charge you more. So it's not even like you're guaranteed when you hand over that check that that's the end of the money that you're gonna have to pay.
And you're not guaranteed to get anything.
And you're not guaranteed to get anything. So this is just for them to look to see if there's anything that they wanna give you or it, and then at that point they can then go to these many exemptions that I talked to you about and say no. Or just redact it all and give you a black sheet, which happens a lot.
And when I added the fees they charge, you saw some people did go away. Like a request was made, they said, okay, give us $1,000 and do that.
Absolutely. One other thing that the way the law is written and sometimes people make this mistake is that they'll try to appeal that cost to the Attorney General. And the way the law is written is that the Attorney General, and there's tons and tons of decisions that he's had to say, it's not up to me. Cost has to go through the court. And so even if the Attorney General feels like what they're assessing is egregious, outlandish, or excessive, he cannot say no to the cost.
Good
you
point.
then have to go to the court, which of course you're already $150 in for a filing fee. So it's just a broken system in terms of what can be done monetarily to prevent you from accessing these records. And if you don't have deep pockets, I'm not gonna cry broke, but media is not as powerful as it once was money-wise. And outlets do not just have an open checkbook that they can be doling out money to pay for something that the public has already paid for.
And to that point, WJR and the Boston Globe just appealed fee request of like $1,000 for bridge documents to the Attorney General, and he said, no, you have to go to the court to get the fees waived. He did lecture the governor, but
He does that.
still have to pay the fee until the law changes. So can you just tell us briefly about what the proposed legislation would do?
I'm actually not
John
super
will tell us
familiar
that.
on that, so maybe John can tell us at the end.
Colleen, how much can search fees be a barrier for smaller news organizations?
I mean, they're a huge barrier. We're 5 people at EcoRI. We're 3 reporters, one of us / columnist, a publisher and an editor. And then we have some freelancers, but we have a very small freelance budget. And I usually make my requests on to pay for public records requests to my publisher, who holds the purse. And I've had her say to me can you maybe make this request in May? We have really high expenses this month. We can't do this right now.
And how's that work if it's breaking news? You're asking for something that's in the news, right? Wait till
Sometimes
May.
I really fight for it, and then other times I can't,
Right.
And because we're so small, and because I'm really interested in it. I know a lot about our financials because I go to the finance committee meetings for a nonprofit, so everything's committee run, and we have a board of directors. So I have a deep understanding of how it all works, which is also helpful and not helpful when you try to ask for a raise. So I know a lot of the time we can't really afford that right now, and then so sometimes it is so should I pay for it right now and then try to ask to be reimbursed later, and I'm 25. I don't make a lot of money. I don't shop at Whole Foods. I only, this was a splurge. So I think it's really difficult, and that $300 was a lot, but I was the fact that it's this expensive means that we're gonna get, for the write-outs right there, we're gonna get a good story out of it. A lot of the time, the way they play their games about, oh, we're gonna charge a huge fee to try to deter you, I'm kind of a little bit in pain when it comes to saying, all right, well, how can I narrow this to be within an hour's worth of work, so I get that free hour, first hour free? Can I make multiple requests and say I'm gonna ask for a year now, a year later, you know, stuff like that. Which,
Layaway plan.
exactly, like, which, you know, I feel bad doing that. I don't want to be a pain in the butt. Like, I'm constantly asking RIPTA for requests for stuff because they have so much data on how late buses are, how much fares they're getting, things like that. So I'm always asking them for data, and I am a wicked pain to Roy, who's their like a public records person. But it's like kind of the game you have to play, which is unfortunate. And then there's, you know, with RIPTA, I feel like I have a, you know, cover all their meetings, and I have met all the people in person, and so I can kind of finagle things with them, but I can't do that with like the Department of Transportation. I don't think any of us can do that, as seen by the exorbitant and random fees that they've charged media. So it's really difficult.
Well, keep being a wicked pain. You know, John will explain more about the bill later, but one thing it would do is to provide more of search time free, and one thing it would do is allow public bodies to say we're going to waive the fee in the public interest. Now, the McKee administration's opposed that legislation and that provision specifically. So let me ask you what you make of the McKee administration saying that its concerns that mandating that fees be waived because the determination of what records are in the public interest presents a complex question, they say, both of fact and law, that a court is best equipped to decide, not a public body.
I mean, it's rich that he would say that, because he's having his attorneys handle all of these bridge requests anyways. And I think all of us sitting here who read the bridge emails, like I painstakingly went through all of it, there was nothing in there. That was not $300 worth of emails. That was not $500 worth of emails. It was like maybe $10 worth of emails. It was like literally, I'm not kidding guys, like if you read, I think it's probably on all three of our websites. You go through it and it's like, okay, Teams meeting. Okay, 5 pages of Teams meeting. Like this is what you really searched for. Like this is what you charged us for. I don't understand why they think that like a judge who is an attorney is going to make a better decision about it than the internal attorneys would. But really, I think the public records custodian in the individual department who is not an attorney should be able to make that determination. I personally don't think that, again, I think we should just get away with search fees altogether, and I think public interest is a little bit like nebulous. But no, I mean, at the end of the day, the point is they know that no one's going to drag them into court to waive a $1,000 fee when they're paying $5,000 in attorney's fees. That's the entire point, right? McKee doesn't want. It's not just opposed to it; he's opposed to any more transparency and wants more secrecy. So I think it's a farcical argument.
So it's almost 11:30. So finally, can you each give us one reason why the average Rhode Islander should care about APRA, should care about public records, and why does a strong public records law matter? Eli.
Yeah, I think, so when I ask for public records and they say no, I still get paid, right? I'm not asking because I, Eli Sherman, am interested. I am interested, but it's my job to try and find these things on behalf of the public, right? Our whole purview here is to try and gather information and inform the public so that the public may make decisions about their life. If they say no, I'm gonna go home and I'll sleep fine, but really what they're saying is no to the public. And I think that what is so important about this law is that it really is, for all its flaws, one of our best tools, which is kind of sad, right? We've spent the last hour or half hour, whatever, telling you how problematic it is, but it still is our best tool in a lot of situations. So I can't stress enough that when you, the public, and I assume that you're here, you're an informed group of people, you should care about the public records law because it really is sort of one of the best tools that we can use to try and better inform you as a public.
Colleen?
I think that the stories that you end up not enjoying, sometimes getting angry about. A lot of them tend to be like the stories that are built on public records, and I think a lot of times people don't realize that because, you know, we attribution is funny in journalism, but I think we're not like always as glaring about it. And I think that, you know, you just find out things that you wouldn't otherwise know. And they are doing some, not all, government's not all bad, but like there are some things that are happening that I don't think anyone should feel okay about. So I think you can tell some of the most important stories about what's going on right now through public records, and so I think you should care. Even if you're not going to be the person who's submitting those requests, even though you can and you should, because I think it's more for FOIA, the federal law, than for state laws, but frequently it's like these big corporations that are making a lot of these requests to benefit themselves and make a lot of money off of them. You should be making requests too, but we're kind of those representatives doing that for you. It's super important. These are the things that are going to change, you know, the course of how policy works and how things happen, and, you know, could have big impacts on what happens with the bridge, what happens with, you know, the next election. So I think you guys should care. I think you obviously all do care being here.
There's a wheel. When I was coming here this morning, I told my 17-year-old son what this was about, access to public records. That sounds exhilarating. So tell him what he's missing.
So I think that, like, as much as like I want to like advocate as a journalist, I'm gonna instead advocate for you as the public, because I think that a lot of the time, why I think that you personally should like care about your personal access. So I think that obviously we there's a lot of things that we're, you know, asking records for, but I think that a lot of the times, especially as the media landscape continues to shrink, that there's a lot of things that you're going to want, and you don't realize you're going to want access to them until something really, really, really bad happens. So let's say you have a relative, a son, a child, whatever, in custody at ACI, and they die. And like obviously that's the journalists are going to like want the records on that, or maybe they're not going to know about it. But at the end of the day, I think that you want the autopsy report to know what happened to your child or your loved one or whoever. I think that you're going to want to have access to the police reports to know how that person was treated. I think that, you know, speaking of incident reports, like we're talking about us as journalists, but I think that if you're involved with the police, if you have a negative interaction, you should also be able to get those records, and you should be demanding that you have access to those records to know what the police were doing. You know, I work with a lot of body cam, and it is incredibly illuminating when you get the body cam for an incident. And for a lot, I mean, even for non-arrest incidents, you get the body cam and you hear what the officers are saying. I was involved, or saw a story where there was an eviction at a low-income complex in New Mexico, and the officers are talking to each other on their body cams about how these people are trash and how, you know, really awful language. So I think that like you as the public, you should be pressing to know. I think the other reason is that, you know, we didn't talk about this yet, but there's a concept called pass the trash, which refers to school districts that allow abusive teachers to go from school district to school district with positive or neutral recommendations despite allegations of misconduct or sexual misconduct. And the same thing exists with police officers. And I think that if you're a parent and your kid comes to you and is complaining about something that, you know, not always is it going to rise to the level that a journalist wants to cover it, but I think that you probably should have access to those records. And that you should have access to the parts of the personnel file that aren't the personal identifiers to know what happened at the teacher's last school. Because maybe nothing happened and maybe you're leading a witch hunt, but maybe the teacher was fired from their last school for sexual misconduct and they passed the trash to the next district. So I think that all of you will, even if you don't in this moment, at some point in your lives have a vested interest in a robust and good public records law. And I think that the problem is that you don't realize that you want it until you need it, and when you need it is when you are essentially in a time of crisis.
And just briefly, you mentioned the police body cameras. They didn't have those when this law was last updated. And so tell us about how the proposed legislation would address, or maybe this is a good opportunity for John to address that. John, may I please come up and tell us about this Access to Public Records Act bill introduced by Senator Palmer and Representative Serpa.
So, I know we do this at the end, but thank you very much to our panelists. We talk, it's access to public records, but really, like, journalists are the ones who are acting on our behalf. And I think we're all super grateful for what they do day in and day out to fight for access, because they're not only requesting, but they're, I've seen a lot of these appeals letters that they're writing to the Attorney General, and they're really putting forth the arguments to try to get us the records. So I'll be brief because we want to get to your questions. We have, a lot of really intelligent people in the audience who have a lot of experience. Steve Alquist is here, who's done lots of requests. Jamie's here from Providence Streets Coalition. And I especially want to point Steve Brown, so, was mentioned kind of the Common Cause bill. It's really, the ACLU wrote the bill. So Steve's the brains behind what's in the bill. We're just one of several groups along with the League of Women Voters that's advocating for it. It would, as somebody mentioned, there's 47 changes in the bill. I'm not going to go through them, but they fall into roughly 4 categories. One is technology. So on the last question, body cams are new, and there's a policy in place for body cams. It would require body cams that images that come from a use of force incident to be released within 30 days. Right now, it's kind of an indefinite period of time that they can be held on to. But the whole point of body cams for use of force incidents is you need to get that information out, those images out quickly, so the public can make their own determinations. So it deals with 911 tapes for the first time. Currently in Rhode Island, 911 tapes aren't releasable under the public records law. So under a series of conditions, they can be released. And some other issues of technology. So that's one area. Another area you've heard about is it deals with these fees. So it does not give Wheeler what he wants. It does not get rid of the fees, but it gets you from 1 hour to 2 hours free search and retrieval. And it actually doesn't let them charge for the first 2 hours of redacting. So it's kind of ridiculous that currently you can be charged for them to withhold information from you. So this is a first attempt to say, like, we're going to give some free time for them withholding information from you. And I recently dealt with a public radio reporter who all he wanted was how much the attorney was charging the town of Westerly, and what for. And he got 326 pages of bills from the attorney to the town. The bill was 326 pages long, and every single thing was redacted on all 326 pages of the bill. He wouldn't even say, the lawyer wouldn't even say what he was charging the town for. This law would narrow the exemption for what can be withheld under attorney-client privileges. Whole section on police records. You heard a little bit about incident reports that don't involve arrests, body cams. There are other things, including the results of internal affairs investigations, which are public now, but it would make it easier to access. And then penalties. So somebody said, Eli said, like, it's kind of a farce that if a penalty, the few times penalties are imposed, it goes from one pocket of government to the other pocket of government. It would actually require that any penalties go toward compliance with the law by municipalities. So it put it in what's called a restricted receipt account, so that the money would be spent on actually trying to make things public. So everybody should have this handout. If you don't, they're by the door. This explains some, but not all of the changes, and has the bill numbers. And two things. One, there's a QR code, so if you want to, you can sign a petition in support of the bill. And also, the bill is actually having its first hearing this Tuesday night in the Senate or House Committee on State Government and Elections. So you can submit testimony, even if you can't show up. So you can reach out to Common Cause, reach out to ACLU. We can instruct you about how, if you want to physically show up Tuesday night, how to physically show up. But if you don't have the time, how you can submit testimony. Because it's going to take more than reporters and professional advocates. It's going to take the public demanding these changes. So I will leave it at that and let Ed field some questions from the audience. But thank you again for spending a Saturday morning talking about public records. A beautiful Saturday morning, no less.
Thank you. So now, fire away. What questions do you have for our panel? Yes.
Colleen, I was wondering what the requests that you made to get, what was the emails or what were the responses to other requests? What is that called? In other words, do you understand what I'm saying?
Like, how did I phrase that request?
Yeah, to find out that in fact there have been 12 other requests and what have been the results of those requests.
Yeah, so I guess I sort of phrased, I had to make two different requests because I realized my first appering other people's appers was like too narrow, but I asked for like any requests both through the APRA law or informal requests via email, phone, letter, because you have to specify, or I try to specify the types of communication I'm looking for, internal or external, that were requested for any crash location data. That's how I asked for it. And all with the exception of the private company that got the data from RIDOT, RIPTA, which entered a non-disclosure agreement with RIDOT to get the information, which is kind of wild because it's also another government entity, but they had to sign an NDA to get the location data. Interesting. And then a fire department, and I can't remember what town in West Bay, all of them said this is denied for the same reason that I was getting denied, which was that they wouldn't give out the data because they were basically paraphrasing because they were afraid that it would get them sued. It could lead to loss. Is that answer your question?
Yeah, I just didn't know if it was a special sort of request.
No, it was through, and there's like a lot of kind of tricky things that you can do, like with Apple when they're messing with you. That's one of them. Eli, I went to the New England First Amendment Coalition's Institute earlier this year that teaches you a lot about this stuff, and Eli was one of the teachers. And he was saying that sometimes you can request your own name and things, like if you want to mess with them a little bit, which I have not been bold enough to do, but I would be kind of curious with a couple of government officials what they're saying about me. So.
Eli, have you asked for your own name?
Yeah, one time when I was reporting in Massachusetts, the district attorney there was jerking me around on something, so I filed another request asking for all references to my name between all staff, and they promptly gave me what I had been originally looking for.
I love that. All right, other questions? Yes.
Some years ago, a state legislator was involved in a 911 call. It was a police case, and I think, and I'm not sure of the details, I think it was when you were at the Journal, state legislators, Bea's wife or something, she called 911. And at that time, 911 calls were open to the public. You could get those records. Right after that, someone, I don't know if it was this person or someone else, introduced that bill into the General Assembly that 911 calls would be closed. I'm curious, Eli, are you a native of Rhode Island?
I'm from Vermont originally.
Well, close enough. I'm saying here, by the way, I'm Linda Longford Levin, and I'm the president of Access and a professor emerita of journalism at URI, was the department chair for years, and a reporter at the Journal before that. How much do you think, and listening to Wheeler, I'm particularly interested in the answer to this, how much do you think the culture of Rhode Island, and it's, I think if you had to have a motto for Rhode Island, it's, I know a guy. And you all know what I'm talking about, if you've lived here very long. How much of that do you think plays into this resistance to changing and upgrading and improving the Access to Public Records Act and all of the pieces that go into it? For instance, getting autopsy reports here, been impossible, they're closed. And journal reporters have tried over the years, individuals have tried over the years to get autopsy reports, and they how much of that culture would make it more difficult in Rhode Island to get these changes through than, say, in New Mexico?
Yeah, I think culture is a big part of it. I think exemption M maybe is an exemption of all communications between elected officials and their constituents. Very broad. Is that right? Is that M? Something like that. And it just, so basically any communication that a city leader or the governor has with their constituents, you can't see. They can redact that. They can withhold that, not give you that. Why?
And you see, like, I think the example is in Alaska, emails for Sarah Palin revealed a lot. I mean, other states provide access to those communications and the technologies change. So that's in the bill too, that would change in the proposed legislation.
Yeah, and there are some very tricky things about the law. I mean, in Massachusetts recently, they are no longer releasing police reports or police records of domestic violence incidents. I believe that they changed that law about 4 years ago. And it was advocated for by domestic violence advocates. And they believe, they argued successfully that it could be damaging once again to survivors. And so it's not, and respectfully, I understand that, but it also adds a layer of opaqueness to who are the abusers, and should we know that? And it's made it all the more difficult to be able to understand that world in Massachusetts for the public. So there is some tug, and there are people who want changes that move away from transparency, sometimes for good reasons, but I find that sunlight is always best.
Yes, and really, could you address, Florida, you always get hear the 911 calls. As Linda points out, we used to have 911 calls accessible here in Rhode Island, but I think it was like state prosecutors relative or something that was involved, and Senator Gorham introduced a bill maybe in the 70s, but that changed, and public radio has done great reporting on 911 calls and trying to hold the dispatchers accountable, but we're very limited, right?
Incredibly limited. Just I think it's just a black box. And I will say, like, having had access to 911 calls, it's so important in the dispatch logs, because the amount of stuff you can get from that, the names or like the locations or whatever, but also to your point about how hard is it to get things or how to change things. I feel like I'm originally from Nevada. I spent 5 years in New Mexico. And coming to the Northeast, I think that like more Massachusetts, but certainly Rhode Island as well. It's like, I swear every single time I suggest something, because I'm not from here, because I have seen how other places operate. It's like I'm in the musical Fiddler on the Roof, and it's just Tevye singing the song Tradition. Like, why do we do this? Because it's tradition. Like, why do we hide things? Because it's tradition. Everything, it's like, I know a guy is essentially tradition. So I think it's profoundly, I think the other problem is like we have to get people to care. I mean, like we can complain about not having 911 logs, but like it doesn't matter if we complain because we complain about everything. Like the problem is the public has to come and complain. The public has to complain to their legislators and say this is not okay.
Steve?
Mike, I think one of the things we're not talking about is the Attorney General not really doing the job of enforcing correctly or promptly. He doesn't allocate enough resources to open records to access public records or to Open Meeting Act violations. And like you were talking, 5 months they've been waiting for a decision. I got an email yesterday. The city of Woonsocket was supposed to reply in 10 days. 5 months later, they sent them a reminder that they hadn't replied. I'm like, are you kidding me? This is where we're at. I thought our case was being slowly adjudicated. It wasn't. It was just sitting there and looked at for all this time. And when he says things in public like, oh, I want to prioritize things from reporters, which in one sense I understand and agree with a little bit, but I also think that means he's not prioritizing stuff that's being put in by average citizens, right? So if you're saying, hey, everybody here should be putting these in or using this resource, but he's prioritizing stuff, and also, let's face it, for political reasons. He doesn't mind embarrassing the governor because they're not getting along, right? So he'll do things to hurt the governor, but he won't do things, let's say Mayor Smiley if I ask something about him. I guess that's an example, I don't know where they stand, right? So how do we get him to do, my question would be, how do we get him to do a better job on this, allocate more resources, take it more seriously? And do we call him out since he's the guy we're supposed to be going to when we have a problem? Do we really want to call him out? Because I call him out in person, but I sometimes call him out in person, that's true, but I don't do it aggressively as I should, I think, because I let him off the hook, so, please.
Who wants to handle that?
Yeah, I think that there's an extraordinary amount of discretion that's given to the Attorney General in this process. He basically acts as the administrative overlord of all of our complaints, and almost all of them go through him because you have two options when you want to complain about if you feel like a public body has violated the Access to Public Records Act. You have two options. Well, three options. One, you can appeal it to the person you just asked the record from, which is a silly step because they just said no to you. Why would you appeal it to the person that just said no? Doesn't make sense. Second option is to appeal it to the Attorney General, and you can do that without having to pay money. I write my own complaints, always have, and obviously lean on smart people, many of you in this room, about how I can frame that in an intelligent way. And then option three is to go through the courts, and courts cost money, and it's harder to argue in that realm without a lawyer because they know how to navigate judges and filing fees and all the other things that come along with it. So really the Attorney General is the best option. And to your point, Steve, when I put in an Access to Public Records Act, I am already thinking from the beginning how it's going to go through this process. I'm already thinking about my complaint. I'm thinking about how I can win. I frame the questions in ways that I know that I can later argue I did correctly. And this comes from years and years and years of doing it wrong. And getting told no and then going through the process and realizing, oh, darn, I should have framed it a different way because then I'd be on better ground to argue it. And that's complicated, and that's not something that you should, as a member of the public, should be expected to know. And part of it is navigating a person. In this instance, it is Peter Nerona, who I would say leans more towards transparency than some of his predecessors have. But it is not perfect, and it's complicated, and there's a lot of nuance.
Yeah, the ACLU just cited an example, speaking of his predecessor, former Attorney General Kilmartin had a decision about rejecting requests for information on lapel pins, correct? So it can get worse. Other questions? Yes?
It's kind of a roundabout, so I apologize. I've been a journalist for 10 years now. I work for the East Bay Media Group, so weird situation is funny to say this.
Go ahead here.
The kind of question is that just in dealing with this myself over the course of my career, some in Massachusetts and then for the past 5 years in Rhode Island, I've just noticed that there's some foundational problems with this, a lot of which has been touched on tonight, which is one, the Attorney General has too much power. If you have a bad Attorney General, you know, it could go really awry. Two, I'm a compassionate person. I think about the people that are working in government. I don't see them as villains. I don't see them as evil, trying to prevent people from knowing stuff. Sometimes that happens, but for the most part, they're people clocking in and doing a job just like anybody else. The thing I've noticed the most in working in Rhode Island over the past few years is that everyone is terrified of getting sued. That's why solicitors answer emails. That's why solicitors are chosen to do the bulk of work that should be done by town clerks. There's an issue in one of my towns. They just got hit with an $8 million settlement from an issue that I can't get records to because the case is under seal in Supreme Court. So there's no way to really break in to see what happened, why they paid the settlement. All these things combined for me thinking, is there a better way to do this? Is there a better way to remove the responsibility from these people that are working in these government agencies who are literally just thinking, if I give them this information, am I going to get fired or am I going to get sued? So is there a way to remove that sort of responsibility from their shoulders and have almost like a board of, you know, specifically dealing with public records requests in that part of the government, so that it's not all the purview of the Attorney General, and there's like an authoritative board that they have to answer to, that's not like Eli Sherman from WPRI, who I can bat away for a little bit and charge $500. I know it's sort of pie in the sky and aspirational, but that's how I think. So is there any kind of value to that idea of a more neutral third-party board that's not just the Attorney General or someone else?
Yeah, you know, there is a bill Representative Newberry has in that would centralize all the requests. I don't have my mind around it totally, but yeah, there are other models in other states for how ACRAs are handled. I mentioned New York.
I could be wrong. When I went to the NEFAC Institute, there were a ton of people from Maine, and I think under the impression that they have some sort of either an ombudsman, I always can't pronounce the word, or like a council, but I think the trouble is it doesn't meet very frequently, and that becomes a problem too. So it's like, you know, at least with the Attorney General, you have someone who's held accountable to voters versus appointees. So I think there's problems with both, but so I guess my feeling is that if things were just more open in general in the law, maybe that would make life easier if there's fewer exemptions and there's, you know, someone, you're not having to go to anybody for a judgment because, you know, things should just be public, but.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that I don't necessarily think there should be a third party, but I think that there is something to be said about, especially in Rhode Island, where the Attorney General is the DA that we would have in other states. I think there is something to be said about, you know, maybe not having the Attorney General be that, because he is also the attorney for state entities, and instead moving it to the Secretary of State or someone else and giving them all of the same enforcement powers, all of the money to enforce the law, and all of the same mandates. So then there is not that conflict of like, oh, I represent you sometimes and I am coming against you sometimes. But that's like on state agencies. I mean, at the end of the day, like the locals, yeah, I think the problem is the exemptions. And I think the problem is like the culture of secrecy.
Linda, do you want to say something?
That's an interesting question. When Access was formed back in the late 1990s, one of our issues was that very question. Why do we have to have the Attorney General as the arbiter of open records cases? And we talked to people in the Secretary of State's office as a possible landing place, if you will, for these issues. Not interested. Over the years, we have tried to figure out an answer to that very question. We've looked at, I remember having members of the Connecticut Freedom of Information Coalition, or whatever it is, which are a group of citizens, most of them are lawyers, who handle these issues in Connecticut. They came to my house and we sat there and spent a whole morning trying to figure out how Rhode Island could do something like this. And we haven't been able to get the changes made because it's a difficult state to get changes made.
You know, we've been slamming some public officials, but it's good to see Representative Sherry Cruz here today. Other questions?
I'm curious, like Colleen, I've gotten good at submitting several small requests as opposed to one larger one to try and avoid fees because you don't always know what you're gonna get and if there was a story or if I'm gonna get reimbursed for fees from the company. So I'm curious if you have other like hacks under the current law that you've started using or you guys have discovered to make things easier.
I feel like Eli would be better answering this question because all the things I know about this I learned from him.
Yeah, you know, I actually try, as much as I use APRA, it's usually a last resort because it comes with a legal process. And so I will try every avenue of where did this document touch? Where did it go? Who has seen it? Who might have it? If I can't get it from the police office or the police station, does it exist in court? If it is with the governor, did it also go to the speaker? You know, I try and stay away from APRA as much as possible because of this nebulous world that exists with it. But if you have to use it, sometimes it helps to know exactly what you're asking for, because then you can be super specific and you can avoid them trying to hit you with fees. And the way you do that is by trying to talk to as many people as possible who may not give you the document, but they may tell you where it is, or what it is, or what's in it, and then you can be hyper specific. I want this document which exists with this person that is detailing this subject. And that way they really can't be like, oh, it took us 40 hours to find that document that you're talking about, Eli. It's like, no, I know it exists. It's there. I'm very specific. Go get it. Give it to me. And so there are avenues that you can try and go through. It's mostly through having conversations with people to try and keep your requests as specific as possible. I do find that when you make these bigger requests that you're always going to get hit with these fees, and then you're sort of back where you started. I will note too, one thing, and I don't know if this is a byproduct of a diminishing press, but I requested building permits from the town of Warren the other day, and I just emailed the clerk and I said, I'd like these. If somebody is there that I should be asking for, please let me know. They gave me the building director's name and building official's name, and I reached out to him asking for the same thing. And then I got a response back from the clerk who said, thank you for submitting your APRA. And I didn't submit an APRA, right? I did not do that.
So they categorized it as a
And this
formal
happens
request.
more and more and more, where public bodies are defaulting to treating your request for information as APRAs. And I think it gets to your point that there's a lawyer there that's saying, look, we need to do this by the law so that we don't expose ourselves to some sort of liability. I think also it's being used to weaponize whether or not they want to give it to you. And I'm sure there are a lot of reporters here where you used to just be able to call the person with that document and say, hey, can I have that document? And they'd say, yeah, here's the document. There is a movement, in my experience, that people more and more so are actually just treating everything as that way, which is absurd.
I think you're being told.
I called spokespeople and they say, all right, I'll put that APRA request in for you. I was like, no, I'm asking you to give it to me now.
Right.
Yeah. I'm a deadline.
But
yeah,
I just said that I
Trigger
think
the
clerks
phone.
are being told this.
Yes.
Because I've talked to clerks who've told me, I can't make a move on this without talking to a lawyer. So I have to print this up the chain, and then I get back and it comes back down. So Woonsocket is a great example. I can walk into the city hall, talk to the clerk who I know a little bit, and they say it has to go to the mayor and come back down, and that means it goes to the mayor and all lawyers, and then it comes back down automatically. So it's automatically an APRA just by asking any one question.
I think that to both of your points, I think that I don't know what the reform is, but there needs to be something that makes it like, I think the liability needs to be put back on the clerks. Like in New Mexico, if you're suing somebody, you're suing the clerk, and the clerks were like well aware when I was covering the small city that I covered, that when the police department was refusing to give them documents, they would say, the police department is refusing to give me this document that I know is a public record, and I know my ass is on the line because you're going to sue me, and I'm the one who's responsible because I'm the clerk, and I can't get the mayor to make the police department comply, and I can't get the police department to comply with the law. And it's insane that people are like, oh, I have to ask the solicitor. Like, no, I think the problem is that clerks are no longer seeing their jobs as being records custodians. Because we can say after, but ultimately they're a records custodian. And that's it's a historical job and it's part of their job. And they shouldn't, unless it's something very specific or deals with a sealed court record, nobody should have to go run to the attorney. And I think that that's part of the problem that's going on, is there's a lack of education, and there's sort of a, also attorneys have I hate to say attorneys sometimes give bad advice, but they have a vested interest in running up attorney's fees.
So we're past noon here. I just want to thank Access RI. I want to thank our panelists for coming on. I want to thank you for coming on, and